Okay, here in Krita, when you open a new canvas, it automatically starts with two layers, a background layer and a transparent layer on top. Krita locks the background layer for some reason. It wants you to paint on layer 1. So, okay, let's just draw that same circle. I can push the plus button here to make a new layer. Let's drag this below layer 1, and I will get my fill tool, make the same red ball. This, by the way, is where the grow selection thing might come in a bit handy. If I undo that and redo it, okay, my threshold is set too high. Let's drop that down, and there we go. The expanded fill kind of covers that pencil line a little bit. In Photoshop, it didn't do that. It kind of went to the first edge of the pencil, but sometimes it's nice to fill the pencil line by a few pixels, and this grow selection feature is where that can really come in handy. Let me go back to my line layer, and I'll double click it and just call it line. I can access layer blending modes here, just like in Photoshop, and there's multiply. Multiply is the typical setting for any line drawing because you want those lines to appear dark. So multiply will ensure that they darken the layers underneath it. If I wanted to adjust the color of that red ball, I could go up to Filter, Adjust, Hue Saturation Value Adjustment, or HSV adjustment. And this is like the hue saturation box in Photoshop. You have your 3 properties here. Now, Krita has prioritized that Lock Transparent Pixels button. It's right here on the right-hand side of every layer. Krita calls it Alpha Lock. So I'll push it and get this airbrush tool and push B for brush. I could do the same thing where I can brazenly use my brush, but Krita will clip it to the influence of the ball that's already on the canvas. Let me undo that though. If I wanted to make a clipping mask, it's a bit different here in Krita. Click the source layer that you're going to base this on and push Ctrl-Shift-G. This creates what Krita calls a clipping group. And inside that group, it has your initial layer, the red ball, plus this new mask layer. And on that mask layer, now it acts the same as it did in Photoshop. I have this as its own thing. Essentially, this is just a layer group. And it seems more complex, but I do like how the thumbnail of the group shows the entire result of the group. Photoshop didn't do that. Oh, and by the way, you can change the size of those icons right here. Make them a little larger or smaller. Something like this might be nice. And while I'm here, I'll just expand my entire layers window. But now that I have a clipping group, I can unfurl it, click on the plus button to make a new layer, and you have to click on this A button, which essentially tells it to use the transparency from the bottom layer. So same thing. This being on a layer, I could erase out of it, paint back into it. I could click into the blending mode. And you notice I have a lot more options here in Krita. And honestly, I don't know what half of them do. I just kind of play with them until I find what I like. Although my tried and true ones are like Lighten, which was similar to Screen in Photoshop. Obviously Multiply, which we've already talked about. Color Dodge, which is similar to Linear Dodge. There's also this Addition one, which is another way of lightening pixels. So if I wanted to lighten this sphere with Add mode, I could pick a darker red and lighten it this way. And then maybe go even lighter and create that highlight. Then I'll scroll down, select the background. Let's go into my DVAD brushes. Let's get this brush here. And you notice I can't paint on the background. That's because it's locked. So I will unlock it and that will allow me to paint. I'm not sure why Krita locks the background. They must have some logical reason for it, but I can't discern what it is. Anyway, we'll kind of recreate the painting we had in Photoshop here. And then maybe create a new layer, which is outside of my clipping group. And on that new layer, I will go ahead and paint a shadow on the table. Cool. Then I'll click into my shadow layer here, the shadow on the ball, that is. And with the brush selected, I can select brush blending modes, which, just like in Photoshop, is the same menu as the layer blending modes. Let's go ahead and pick Screen, change the opacity of the brush a little bit, and we will lighten some of the reflected light of the ball in shadow. And just to show you some very simple layer functions in Krita, deleting a layer, you got the trash can icon there. You can right-click on the layer and say duplicate. It gives you a shortcut there, Control-J to do that, and I'll just trash that one. The opacity of your layer is this slider up here at the top. You could right-click and say copy layer, then say go to the very top up here and right-click and say paste layer, and then it'll paste it above your selected layer. Not that I would do that in this case, because it puts the shadow on top of the ball, but it is handy that you can quickly do that. To merge layers, you could right-click and say merge with layer below. Shortcut there is Control-E, and that merges those two layers. You could right-click on any layer and say flatten image, which merges all the layers. Or I'll undo that. A handy little thing, right-click on any layer and say new layer from visible. This will merge all your layers and put it as a layer on top, but all the initial layers that went into it are still intact. At this point, I could hide all these layers with the eyeball icon, just to show you they're no longer affecting the picture because they're all merged above, and I can continue my painting on this one layer here. This is a good way to kind of bookmark your progress, you might say. Almost like a save game or something. Let me show you something pretty cool you can do with textures. And you could do the same thing in Photoshop, I just didn't happen to show it there. I did my old Google search for texture again, found this one. I'll right click and say copy image. Then here in Krita, I'll Control V for paste. I'm just going to click the As Web button there, and it pastes the texture in. I'll set its blending mode to multiply. And instantly I have a photographic texture overlaid on my painting, which I could move around where I want it to be. I could push Control T, which unfortunately changes the view of it, but I'd like to right click and do some liquefying, which allows me to sort of shape it like a sphere. I'm going to try and get this texture to feel like it's wrapping around the sphere. People commonly use the liquefy tool here to kind of correct drawings, and it's certainly well used for that. I do that too, although in this case I'm trying to warp a texture around a ball. Okay, let's just say okay to that by pushing enter. Now I want this texture to only affect the ball, not the entire background like that. So I'll click on this arrow beside the plus button and say transparency mask. This is the same thing as a layer mask in Photoshop. Instead of starting it in full opacity, I'll actually invert the layer mask by going to Filter, Adjust, Invert, shortcut here being Control I. Click that. Now nothing appears to show through because the layer mask is completely black. But if I went in there and got a soft airbrush tool like this guy, I could paint white into the layer mask and kind of subtly reveal the texture where I want it. In this case, on the ball itself. Maybe not so much in the highlight, so I'll paint that black and take that away. And just a few little refining brushstrokes and I have a textured ball. Sure, it looks a bit digital, but when I get to actually doing real paintings, which is coming right up, I'll show you how you can use this more organically. In this chapter, I'm covering the nuts and bolts of how you access this stuff. All right, let's move on to Procreate.